Отож, доброго дня. В нас нова дискусія фокус-теми, яка називається «Чому свобода важить понад усе?» Більше за все. Моє ім'я Наталя Гуменюк, я є кураторкою фокус-теми. Я зроблю представлення українською, а потім, власне, перейду на англійську, якою і відбуватиметься захід. Але тому поки для частини аудиторії зможу розповісти все українською. Професор Снайдер також розуміє українську. Він зараз з нами буде коротко на зв'язку. Отож, і розповім про формат. Власне, Тімоті Снайдер є американським істориком, якого багато хто в Україні знає, істориком Єльського університету, автором великої кількості книг про історію Східної Європи і ті злочини, які відбувалися на цій території. Але окрім того, Тім Снайдер є постійним членом Віденського інституту гуманітарних наук і співзасновником програми Documenting Ukraine. Власне, в такому статусі він зараз є. Проект Віденського інституту, який знаходиться у Відні, Інституту гуманітарних наук, власне, і підтримав всю програму фокусної теми, за що ми їм вдячні. А я розповім трошки за цей час про ініціативу Documenting Ukraine. Це ініціатива, з якою так само ми співпрацюємо тут в Україні з лабораторією журналістики суспільного інтересу, з документування всього, що відбувається під час Великої війни. Це була частково його також ініціатива, яка дає можливість багатьом українським соціологам, журналістам, документалістам, митцям зараз фіксувати те, що відбувається. І я потроху бачу вже Тіма, так, і тому я зможу тихенько почати вже його представляти, але я скажу, як відбуватиметься цей формат. Ми матимемо небагато часу на запитання, але це буде дійсно лекція. So, Tim, I wonder if you can hear us. You should hear me from mic. Yes, you do. So great. You just should imagine, and I'll send later the photo, how huge is the crowd, which is listening to you, is technically the whole Arsenal Valley, book festival Valley. You've been here in the Mystetskyi Arsenal, so you probably can't even imagine how many people they are here. So we would be ready to start. We talk for half an hour around. There would be the lecture, then there would be some questions and answers with my facilitation. So yes, here we are, the focus team when everything matters. And I'm happy to introduce Timothy Snyder, the American historian, the great friend of Ukraine, the professor of the Yale University, but also the co-head of the Documenting Ukraine project at the Institute of Human Science in Vienna, which supports the focus team of the book Arsenal this year. And the topic of the lecture is why freedom matters more than everything. Thank you. The floor is yours. No, we're not yet hearing you, so I'll give the sign. I'll be the person who will tell it's working. Yeah, so I'm searching it from my colleagues from Arsenal, so please wait for another minute. We really have the decision this year. It's the only online event. It's the only online event we really have. So, you know, despite everything was made in order to make it possible. I actually would use this moment. And I'm just sending this picture to Tim why we're setting up the sound, so you really would see this audience, which is really, really, really big. Okay, I'm doing this. Yep, from my photo, and maybe you can. So please let me know. Yeah, everybody, if it's already. Oh, wow. Can you try to speak so we will figure out? Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Looks like yes. Yes? Yeah, so you can start. We hear you.
Okay, excellent. So thank you very much, Natalia. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be able to speak to you at the Knižkový Arsenal this year. I just wish I could be with you personally. Yeah, troszkę mені соромно, що я особисто не там з вами. I want to thank the Knižkový Arsenal. I want to thank Documenting Ukraine for bringing me here. And I want to thank all of you for being present and for thinking along with me. Back in the year 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine the first time, I helped to organize a conference in Kyiv, which was called Thinking Together. And I'm very proud of that name, because that was the beginning of cooperation, not just between the Institute in Vienna and many Ukrainians, but also of a larger intellectual project of mine, which has involved working together with Ukrainians and thinking together with Ukrainians. And I'll be continuing that today. What I would like to do is talk to you about a book about freedom, a book about freedom that I haven't yet finished. It's a philosophical book, which I've been working on for about 5 years now. At various times, I believed that I was finished, and at various times it turned out that I was wrong. It's completely normal for authors to change their minds about whether they're going to publish a book or not. In my case, as I was trying to write a book about freedom, I had various encounters with my own illness, with certain political issues in America, with the war in Ukraine, which led me to believe I still had some more thinking to do. And I'll be doing some of that thinking now with you. Now, the point of this book about freedom is that it's very difficult to talk about freedom. It's very difficult to say exactly what it is. For me personally, as a historian or as a thinker, it's a challenge that I faced as a result of my other books. So in my book on tyranny, I write about how to play defense, how to defend freedom. In my book, Road to Unfreedom, I try to write about what went wrong in Russia and also in Europe, in the United States in the 21st century. And then, as Natalia kindly mentioned, I've written some history books like Black Earth and like Bloodlands, which are about just how horrible the absence of freedom can be, and just how terrible a political system can be. And I don't want to say that it was easy to write those books, but they all leave open the question of what freedom actually is, or what the highest good actually is, or how can it be achieved. It's one thing to write about defending freedom or the decline of freedom or the absence of freedom, but it's quite another to say what freedom is and how it might be achieved. And that's going to be our subject today. So the argument is a philosophical one. And I have to say, one thing I appreciate about this year's Knyžkový Arsenal is that although, of course, it's taking place during a war, it's not entirely about the war. And I think that's very important. I think it's very important that we all be able to think along with the war, but not necessarily to focus everything on the war. And this is the spirit in which I'm going to try to make my argument. I'm going to make a very broad philosophical argument. It has to be true about the world as such. It has to be true during crises. It has to be true during the war. It has to be true inside the war, just as it has to be true inside everything else. Or to put it a different way, the war in Ukraine is one way to test this argument. It's one test of this argument among other tests. So what is the argument? My argument is that freedom has to be the highest value. It has to be more important than everything else. It has to be the highest value because freedom is what enables other values. Freedom is the state in which we as humans can conceive of, can consider, can balance, can combine all of the other values. And this is true regardless of what those values are. My values might be different in a year. They might be different a year ago. They might be different than yours. But regardless of what the values are, freedom serves as a kind of meta value. It is the thing which enables all of the other values. Now, by the word value, I don't mean anything particularly complicated. I just mean the good things to which we commit ourselves. Like, for example, loyalty or honesty or patriotism or universalism or justice or mercy. It's very important for this argument about freedom, and I think for any serious argument about freedom, to say clearly that values are real in the world, that they're just as real as objects. A dam is an object, but when a dam breaks, the things that happen are not happening only in the material world. They're also happening in the world of values. We don't live just as objects in the world. We live through experiences and the values we assign to those experiences. In the 21st century, this seems to me to be a very important point, because a lot of the people who claim to be talking about freedom are saying, actually, there aren't values, or who knows if there are values, and who knows what's good, and maybe nothing is really good. At an extreme point, you can see this in Russian political rhetoric, where the kind of standard Russian propaganda worldview begins from the idea that there aren't really any values. Values aren't real, and you're a fool if you believe in them. The only thing that matters is force. So what I'm trying to say is that when people say that we're not sure if there's anything true, we're not sure if there's anything to be valued, very soon that leads to tyranny. As soon as we deny that values are real, we're beginning a path which leads to the absence of freedom. And again, we see that on the example of the chief tyrants in our world right now, whether they be in Russia or the United States or in China, it doesn't matter. In general, what they do is they assure us that nothing really matters. And as soon as we believe that nothing really matters, all that matters is force, and the people who control the force or seem to control the force are going to win. What I'm trying to maintain is something which can sound a little naive, but I think it's very important sometimes to sound a little naive. I'm maintaining that values are real and that they form a kind of fifth dimension in life. If we think of the four physical dimensions of time and space, we can think of values as a sort of fifth dimension, something which is real, but which operates according to its own laws, a bit like time and space do. So you can think of values as out there in the world and behaving in a certain way. So for example, they don't always go together. Let's think of the examples I gave before. We would probably all agree that loyalty and honesty are both values. They're both good things, but they don't always go together. With a friend, you sometimes have to choose whether you're going to be loyal or whether you're going to be honest. Likewise, patriotism, sometimes good, universalism, sometimes good, but sometimes we have to choose between them or think about how we're going to combine them. Justice and mercy. Mercy can be a kind of exception. It can be a kind of exception to justice. It clashes in a way with justice. That doesn't mean that they're not both values. Now, this point that I'm making, that values don't go together perfectly, once I've made that point, it probably seems very simple or even banal, but this kind of pluralism in the world is very, very important. If we don't accept that there are clashes among values, if we don't accept that values are real in the world and that they sometimes contradict one another, we can find ourselves in a very dangerous position. The opposite position to this is one that we also see in Russia today. Underlying a lot of Mr. Putin's political rhetoric is the idea that there is only really one good thing, and that one good thing is something like Russia. That Russia, because there's only one good thing, because there's nothing else good in the world, Russia is always right. And therefore, the facts about the world don't matter. Nothing Russia can do is wrong because anything done in the service of Russia is therefore right. That seems like a very, simple philosophical position, but I think there's a very strong tradition of thinking like that in Russia. A good example of it is the Russian philosopher Ivan Ilyin, who gets a lot of airtime in Russia today. The view that Russia stands apart from everything else. Russia is always innocent. That's an example of the view that there's only one value. And if we believe there's only one value, just as if we believe there's only no values, we find our way towards tyranny very quickly. Okay, so what I've tried to argue so far is that we live among space, we live among time, and we live among values. And that freedom is the highest value because freedom is the value that allows all the other values to perform. Freedom is a kind of manager of values. It's the thing which allows the other values to be considered by us, to be reflected upon by us, to be combined by us, and to be realized by us in the world. And so if freedom is the highest value, then the next general step in the argument would be that freedom is the purpose of government, or freedom is the thing which legitimizes government. In the book, what I try to do is describe what I call the forms of freedom. I try to explain what kinds of interactions take place between individuals in a society or individuals in a government. How is the space filled between us and the government such that we can be free? And in the book, I rely on what we know about science, the science of child development, for example, to make arguments about what needs to happen so that actual living human beings can grow up to be free. Because if we take freedom seriously and we think freedom has to do with values, then we have to become the kinds of people who are capable of thinking about values, capable of making choices. And that involves some issues which aren't usually considered in discussions of freedom, like childhood. Children have to be raised in such a way that as to be capable of making choices. And that requires cooperative human work. Young people have to learn how to be unpredictable. They have to learn whom and what they should defy. Young adults have to be able to make choices about moving from place to place. There has to be the infrastructure, the institutions that allow them to move from one place to another. Now, for me, the striking thing about these claims, which I think are very simple and almost self-evident, is that they all require cooperative action. Freedom requires cooperative action, and that's the justification of government. That the very things that we need to be free as individuals can't be done alone. They need the help of other people, and very often they need the help of a large impersonal organization of other people, which is what we call government. So these are my general thoughts about what freedom is and what the relationship is between freedom and government. What I'd like to do now is describe what I think of some of the mistakes we make when we talk about freedom, and along the way mention how Ukraine and Ukrainians have helped me to diagnose these mistakes and to answer these mistakes. I'll do this, and then we'll have some time to talk with Natalia and some time for discussion. So what are the mistakes that we make when we talk about freedom? Each of these mistakes, by the way, is also a political trap. So one of the reasons why I think it's worth actually writing about freedom, why it's worth putting a lot of words on a page about freedom, is that the way that we talk about it, at least in my country, I'm talking more now about America than Ukraine, but the way that we talk about it can be very dangerous. We can train ourselves to use the language in such a way that we make freedom meaningless. So in English, for example, people tend to use the word free in front of things that aren't people. Like we talk about free speech or we talk about free markets. In my view, that's a terrible mistake. In my view, one has to reserve the word freedom for human beings. And as soon as you get in the habit of using it to describe something besides human beings, you're being led towards not taking freedom seriously and towards being unfree. Anyway, so what are some of the main political traps? What are the ways that we misuse the language of freedom in such a way that allow us to become unfree? A very, very big one, common around the world, which I think is fundamentally a mistake, is the idea that we have to sacrifice freedom for security. I think this is fundamentally not true. I think when we accept the logic that you have to sacrifice freedom for security, what we're doing is we're preparing the way for leaders, like, for example, Putin in Russia, who will make people less secure and then argue that this is a reason why they have to be less free. If you can make people feel less secure and everyone believes that you have to trade freedom for security, then people will give away their freedom. So I think it's very important, just on practical grounds, to deny this. It's not actually true that giving up security, giving up freedom will make you more secure. Giving up freedom will make you less free. It won't make you necessarily more secure. Now, of course, there are moments where you have to give up freedom for security. Moments, like if you have to go to a bomb shelter during an air raid, that's a moment when you're not free. I accept that. But in general, I think freedom and security work together. In all the political examples I gave above, I was trying to show how, broadly speaking, security and freedom work together. Children who feel secure in their schools or in their playgrounds or in their parks are going to grow up feeling more free. Or in a military setting, when territory is liberated by the Ukrainian armed forces, a liberated village is more free because it's more secure, and it's more secure because it's more free. So that's the first mistake, that we have to sacrifice freedom for security. We don't. We have to recognize that freedom and security work together, and that that's an argument for being concerned about both. A second big mistake I think that people make is the idea that freedom is negative, that freedom is negative, that freedom is just the absence of oppression. Now, at a philosophical level, I think that's not true. If freedom can't just be an absence. If freedom were just an absence, that would mean that we could give birth to a child and then leave that child alone, and that child would grow up free. We know that's not true. We know that in order for a human to become free, lots of other humans have to help along the way. Freedom requires the presence of other people and the actions of other people. And on the large scale of societies in which we live, that those other people have to take the form of a government. So of course, when you're at war, the idea that the government is the problem, or the government is the only problem, can seem absurd. Ukraine has been invaded by another state. And although Ukrainian civil society has been absolutely extraordinary in resisting that invasion, it's quite clear that when you're invaded by another state, you have to have a state of your own. So in conditions of war, it's absurd to think that your own government is the only problem. The question is not yes government or no government. That's a very childish way of looking at things. The question is, what kind of government? What kind of government? If freedom is the legitimation of government, then what government can legitimately do are all the things that make it more likely that we will be free, right? All the things that will make it more likely that we will be free. So this view of freedom is positive. This view of freedom says freedom isn't just a matter of getting a bad government out of the way. Freedom is a matter of us being able to live our lives in such a way so that we can realize our values in the world and change the world individually. Positive freedom means that we see a future. We have an idea of how the future should be. We have values that we can apply to the future, and we have some capability to apply those values. That's, I think, the correct version of freedom. I think positive freedom is the correct version of freedom. One way to think about this is to say that removing oppression is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Of course, people are not free if they're imprisoned or if they're tortured or if they're traumatized. Of course, they're not free then. But releasing them from prison or ending the torture or curing the trauma is necessary for them to become free, but it doesn't make them free. There's more to it than that. They have to be able to see a future. They have to imagine that in some way they can master that future or change that future. Now, this is an argument which I have to say Ukrainians have been helping me to make. As I've been talking, friends like Natalia Gumenyuk or Volodymyr Yermolenko have spoken to me about things like this, but also I've had conversations with quite a few soldiers and quite a few people from Ukrainian lands that have been deoccupied who have said things along these lines that have been really helpful. That it wasn't enough to remove the bad thing, right? That's the point, wasn't just to remove the occupation. Freedom is about what we should be able to do in the future ourselves. And there are thousands of examples in Ukraine that seem to me to confirm this. One of them that Natalia helped me to see personally is in the town of Yahidne, I think in Chernihiv Oblast, maybe northern Kiev Oblast. And in Yahidne, as you will all know, people were held in a basement by Russian occupiers for a month, and several people were killed and several more died. And when those people emerged from that basement, when the town was liberated, that was some of what they needed. They needed to be liberated from Russian occupation. But of course, they, like everybody else in every other liberated Ukrainian village or town, also need other things. In that particular case, they were being held in the basement of a school. So of course, now they don't really have a school and their children don't really have a playground. Those are positive things, right? Schools and playgrounds. We need positive things to become free, not just the absence of negative things. On a larger political scale, I guess the point I would make about Ukraine is that, and it is a point that many, many Ukrainians have already made before me, but I think it's in the logic of what I'm arguing, rebuilding and recovery in the broadest sense also belong to freedom. So battlefield victory, deoccupation, liberation of territory are part of freedom, but another part of freedom is recovery and rebuilding, right? In the sense of not going back to 2021, but imagining a better version of Ukraine, a more free version of Ukraine than existed before the war. Not just removing the unfreedom of the war itself, but imagining a better Ukraine, a Ukraine that's better than the Ukraine of February 2022. The third and final mistake that people make about freedom, I think, is to say that freedom is just about doing anything you want, giving into impulse, doing whatever you feel like. And of course, there's nothing wrong with doing things that are fun. There's nothing wrong with doing things that you feel like doing. I feel like having a drink of coffee right now, so I will. But that's not freedom. That's not freedom. And there's a particular almost paradox, almost contradiction, which Ukrainians have helped me work out. One of the Ukrainians who helped me work this out was President Zelensky. In a discussion with him, when I was talking to him about his decision to remain in Kyiv in February 2022, he said, "I felt as though I couldn't do anything else." Now, he felt as though he had no choice. So it would seem then that he was not free since he didn't feel he had no choice. But I think it's the opposite. I think, in fact, the freedom is such that it will lead us into situations where sometimes we feel we have no choice. Let me try to explain this, because it's apparently a paradox, but I think it's not. And I think many of you probably will already have understood what I mean, because what Zelensky did is, of course, just typical of what millions of other people have done. If everyone yielded to impulse, everyone would run away. If everyone yielded to impulse, we'd all do the easiest thing. And many millions of Ukrainians are doing the harder thing. So how can this be a characteristic of free people? I think it works like this. Freedom happens over time, right? We live in time, we live over time, time passes. And as time passes, we as free people are making choices among values. We have to make choices because there are many values and they contradict each other. Each time we make these choices, we are creating something which I would call character. And as we build up that character, as we become certain kinds of people, certain kinds of free people, then we might find ourselves in a situation where, given our character, it seems to us there's only one thing that we can do. And this, I would say, although it seems paradoxical, is proof that we are free people. If we can resist the impulses, if we can do the thing which is hard rather than the thing that is easy, that means that we are free people. So, and I think this is very important for explaining where Ukraine is, where many Ukrainians are. And I think it's also very important for the state of democracy in the world. We can't explain all human choices just by impulses or even by interests. Sometimes what humans do has to do with being free. It has to do with the accumulation of value choices, with the accumulation of value choices, which makes up a character, which creates a free person. Now, this for me is important, not just as an account of what happens in Ukraine or as what happens in many other places where people believe they have no choice but to do the courageous thing. It's also very important, I think, for the idea of democracy. And this is where I'm going to close. Many of us around the world in the late 20th century and the early 21st century got ourselves convinced that democracy was the result of some kind of natural process, or it was the result of some kind of mechanical process. It was the result of some kind of law of history. It was the result of economics, that capitalism would bring democracy. And the thing is, none of that is actually true. There's nothing natural, there's nothing mechanical, there's nothing predictable about democracy. Democracy is very difficult and it's very rare. And in order for democracy to exist, or in order for democracy to prosper, people have to believe in it. They have to believe that democracy is the right system of government. And in order for people to believe that democracy is the right system of government, that they, the people, should rule, they have to think of themselves as free people. They have to think of themselves as people who are willing to take risks and make choices. If democracy means rule by the people, it's not just any old people. It has to be free. It has to be free people, right? It has to be people who are making choices, not just in a world where they think everything is predetermined, but in a world where they value their own choices and they think their own choices make a difference. So there are a lot of ways to talk about how the war in Ukraine matters for democracy in the world. One can go through all kinds of geopolitical scenarios. One can talk about how Ukraine sets an example, which is true. One can talk about how Ukraine is important for Taiwan, which is true. One can talk about how Ukraine is important for American electoral politics, which is true. But I think the most important truth is actually the ethical one, or the metaphysical one, that I've been trying to talk about, that democracy ultimately depends upon freedom, and freedom depends upon ethics and at least a little bit of courage. That's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I see you partially heard a bit of the applause. That was just some small part of it. So we have some minutes also to ask a few more questions as a follow-up, and then have a few from the audience. So I would go on with the discussion we had before about this positive and negative freedom, but in more, let's say, instrumental way. And I think it's about the region. I think that we're really having the legacy of thinking about the freedom as the freedom from the empires, freedom from the Soviets, freedom from the corruption, from the authoritarian governments. It's probably a legacy also of 1989, you know, kind of how the freedom we see at least my generation. And then we really, even like during the Maidan, we also thought about freedoms as freedom from. Now we're also fighting from. There is an empire which wants to occupy Ukraine. It's very practical. It's for freedom from being occupied. However, I do believe that Ukraine is shaping this idea that freedom should be something else. Freedom as efficiency, freedom as something which is not just, shaping and challenging something, but which is a creative power. Do you see it's understood? Do you see, this notion can be shared and, really be broader than something just the Ukrainian cause? And also in your interactions, how kind of common is this rethinking of freedom for as a creative and the creative force rather than the force of the freeing ourselves?
So I think that is, in a way, maybe the great important debate of our times, what you just said. Because in America, which, whatever you think about it, it's a pretty important country, we are largely caught in the idea that freedom just means being left alone. That freedom just means, being kind of irritable, being kind of anxious and being kind of angry and just wanting people to leave you alone, not wanting to engage with other people, not really believing in government. And the problem with that, there are many problems with that notion of freedom. I mean, I think it's philosophically wrong, but it's also politically really dangerous, because if we all become lonely and alienated and anxious and irritable, and all we think that freedom is being left alone by other people, we won't become very interesting people, but also our politics won't be democratic, because we won't be in the habit of realizing that other people, that values are real, that other people have values, that we have to compromise with those values, and so on and so on and so forth. So I think, what you put your finger on is a really, really crucial debate. Do we think about freedom just in a negative sense, not just politically negative, but also psychologically negative? A lot of people talk about freedom in my country are kind of depressed and angry. And I think that's the wrong mood to be in when you're talking about freedom. I think freedom should be, as you say, something which is about flourishing in the future. It's about being better than you already are. It's about things that are not predictable. It's about a life which might contain things that you can't foresee. Freedom should be a happy concept. The second thing that I wanted to say in response to your question, this is apropos Maidan, and just my little memory of Maidan would include the notion of freedom with, so not freedom from or freedom to, but freedom with. I mean, it was my distinct impression that Maidan showed that people were capable of being free together with other people in a way that they wouldn't have been free alone. So just to give you one example that I remember, when people, I mean, this is true of a lot of my Ukrainian friends, and you people can check your own recollections, but when people were at home watching television and they looked at Maidan, they would be afraid, but then when they actually were on Maidan, they would be less afraid. And I think this is a kind of paradox, like this is a sort of, like you're actually in more danger on Maidan than you are in front of your television. But when you're alone in front of the television, you feel more afraid than when you're with other people. And so I think freedom with is also a very important category. And it's a useful category in this war as well. A lot of what Ukrainians are doing to help one another in this war involves freedom, but it also involves cooperation, even if not with the government, with one another. And so that's a kind of freedom with. And so I guess the way that I think government is legitimate is when government makes freedom with easier rather than harder, right? So this whole tradition of thinking of freedom as negative, it's very understandable. Like I think in Ukraine, it has roots that go back beyond the Soviet Union. I think it has Cossack roots as well. But even the Cossacks, after they tried to rebel against the Poles, they still wanted to write. They still were very legally minded, and they wanted to design their own states. I think it's very natural to think of freedom as freedom from in a certain historical position, but I think at a certain point it does become a lack of responsibility. If we think that we're all that the empire was oppressive and therefore our own state is oppressive or illegitimate, at some point I think that becomes a lack of responsibility. At some point that is us allowing the state to be that way. And one doesn't just have to use Ukraine as an example. I mean, this is true of of any democracy. If Americans think that the state is always oppressive, they allow the state to become more oppressive. If they think the state is just for rich people, then they allow the state to become more for rich people. So at a certain point, you know, in historical development, you have to kind of make the turn and say, well, it may be flawed, it may be imperfect, but it's also ours. We have to turn this state in such a way so that it helps with freedom.
At this stage yesterday, there were 6 soldiers sitting with different backgrounds. And when we're finishing the first discussion of the focus team, they were speaking about the values. I think 5 of them mentioned freedom as something extremely important for them, for what they're fighting for. Yet Daria Zubenko, one of the Ukrainian soldiers and veterans, mentioned that it was always for her the ultimate, value. However, now she speaks about the justice. You mentioned that freedom is enabling, other things. However, I still think in the context of this, very unjust war, how we can think that what are also instrumental beyond freedom, or maybe what the first freedom should enable, what kind of the most important values which goes together with freedom should be enabled and not be left aside.
Mm-hmm. So again, I'm going to say several things, and I hope they amount to an answer. The first is that I just want to observe, as someone who has spent some time talking to Ukrainians who've been fighting this war and spends a lot of time with Russian telegram sources and Russian sources. It's really striking how there are different kinds of people fighting this war, and this is, and it sounds simple, but or almost naive, but it shows that freedom isn't just something out there in the world; it's something which is in people. So of course there are very different kinds of Ukrainians and there are very different kinds of Russians, but in general, the way that Ukrainians and Russians communicate with one another in this war has been very, very different. I don't just mean like the public propaganda. I mean the way that they talk about one another, the way they address one another. And so that's confirmed me in the belief that freedom is not just a presence or absence at a given moment, but freedom involves how people are raised. Freedom involves a whole society. Like freedom has to be something that we do together. Another good example that you've written about is the example of village government, where Russian soldiers had a very difficult time understanding that the local sultan was elected and might actually represent people or care about people or in some way be concerned with people. That's, for me, that has to do with freedom. In that, like if you're not a free person, if you haven't been raised among free people, it's very hard to recognize it, right? Like we're dealing with a different kind of reality. And these really concrete examples, which figure in your writing and which figure in a lot of other Ukrainian journalism, I think need to be taken very seriously. Like that this war, this conflict reveals something important about freedom, that it's not just a presence or absence at a given moment, it's also how people have learned to care about values, have learned to treat each other. Which brings me to justice. I agree. And this is very characteristic of how thinking evolves during war. I mean, if I look at it historically, the resistance fighters during the Second World War, they were never thinking about freedom just as negative. They were thinking about new versions, better versions of France or Poland or whatever it might be. It didn't always work out, but that's how people were thinking. No one goes through a war and says, well, all we need to do is to remove the evil. People begin to think about what the good would be. And I think it's perfectly right to think of justice as being fundamental. I mean, in my own scheme of things, I think more about responsibility, that freedom and responsibility go together, that a free person is also a responsible person, because a free person recognizes that no choice is perfect and that no one is perfectly innocent. And so you're responsible for all the choices that you make. because even as they're imperfect, even as you do your best, whereas an unfree person can be perfectly irresponsible. And again, I think this is a pretty good way of describing Russian behavior. If you are completely unfree, you're also completely irresponsible. And so when I think of holding Russians to justice, right, I think in terms of responsibility, that they ought to be held responsible, which might or might not involve justice, but they ought to be held responsible. The other way I think about this in my own philosophical scheme, and there can be others, is that freedom has to begin with justice, in the sense that freedom has to begin with a recognition that we are all equal. If we don't start from the assumption that we're all equal, then we're not going to get very far with freedom. And the third point I'll make, and then I'll move on, is that practically speaking, freedom involves it has to involve a redistribution. Freedom can't involve a few people owning all of the stuff. Freedom can't involve radical inequality inside one society, because if there's radical inequality inside one society, then there's radical inequality not just of money, but of voice and of power. And there are 2,000 years of political thinking, not just our own experience, which confirms this. So in the book where I write about the forms of freedom, I write also about redistribution, because you need a certain amount of equality in order for society to be free. That's not exactly the same as justice, although one could think about it in those terms too.
Thank you. I kindly would ask you to speak a bit louder, because the audience is growing, honestly, and it's really hard to reach the people further. We have this couple of minutes for questions, because we understood that technically it's very hard. So please, and it would be done this way. I'll translate the question very fast for team, would take 3 of them. And, so it won't be the long statements to cover. So there is a guy here, there is a lady there, there is there, and I'll help to, because you might hear, but I still would have kind of retell it. Давайте.
Українською, англійською?
Давайте швиденько я перекладу. Українською.
Українською. Добре, для мене, як для студента міжнародних відносин, цікавий той факт, що, як Тімоті Снайдер зазначав раніше, свобода передбачає також співпрацю. Однак в теорії міжнародних відносин співпраця між країнами передбачає певні утиски національного суверенітету, тобто вибору свободи, як діяти у внутрішній політиці або зовнішній. І чи можемо ми опинитися в такому вічному колі, коли ми намагаємося досягти міжнародної співпраці і зменшимо тим самим нашу свободу, або намагаємося досягти свободи і зменшимо співпрацю між країнами? Дякую.
Tim, you get the question?
I got it, yeah.
Okay, good. You can cover, because it's pretty specific. Yeah, we have still a few people more, but you can start.
Okay, so in the theories of international relations you're talking about, the state is seen as a kind of individual, right? The state is seen as something which has borders which can't be violated, and sovereignty means that nothing crosses those borders. But actually, that version of the state doesn't really exist. There is no state which is not composed of people and institutions and historical accidents and all kinds of other things. So whether state interactions are oppressive or not really depends upon the states. So I would suggest that it's pretty important for states to cooperate to be free, just as it's important for individuals to cooperate to be free. My children are going to have a hard time being free without their parents and without their schools and without other kinds of institutions. People are going to have a hard time being free without cooperation in general. And there is nothing magical about a state which makes a state anything more than an accumulation of people and laws and accidents and institutions. And states can be better or worse. Personally, I think this was part of the wisdom of Maidan, the recognition that the Ukrainian state was imperfect and it could become better by way precisely of cooperation with other European states. And that, by the way, is the lesson of the whole history of the European Union. none of the states that entered the European Union, including the ones that founded it, were perfect. They all became more prosperous, and I would argue more free by a specific form of interaction. So obviously not every form of interaction between states is going to be liberating, but I think it's important to see that some forms of interaction can leave states freer rather than less free. So I think, the argument kind of works by analogy. If you accept that individuals all alone are not really free, it's probably also true that states left all alone are not really free. The question is, what's the right kind of interaction?
Наступне питання. Так. Ви бачите, там була пані. Ні, ось там, трошки далі, біля другої колони. Будь ласка, підбіжіть і покажіть, де була третя рука. Я не пам'ятаю. Хтось був тут? Ви перейшли. Добре, тоді потім ми до вас підемо. Да. Прийдемо сюди.
Пане професоре, дякую вам за чудову вашу промову. Алла Киридон, доктор історичних наук, професор. Ваша доповідь спонукає більше до роздумів, ніж до сприйняття. Власне, концепція цікава. Передусім, ви сказали, що свобода – найвища цінність. Дозвольте, це не заперечення, але пов'яжіть найвищу цінність життя і свободу. І як виборювати свободу в умовах загрози зникнення? Як виборювати свободу, перебуваючи в умовах нестерпної окупації? І, власне, це все поєднано. У нас в Україні є поняття свобода і воля. Коли ми говоримо бути вільними, і слово свобода, це не зовсім одне і те ж. І врешті апелюю до вашої доповіді. Ви сказали, що свобода – це демократія. Ось оцей мікс, якщо можна. Чи зрозуміло питання? Чи є свобода – це демократія, як і найвища цінність свобода, чи все-таки найвища цінність – це життя? Дякую.
Окей, дякую. Так, зрозумів. So, for me, I guess I wouldn't really oppose the two, because I can't think about freedom outside of the category of life. So for me, the question is, what is the highest value of life? And I don't believe that values, I mean, one can disagree about this, but I don't believe that values exist outside of human life. I think that values are real, but they're real because we believe in them and we affirm them, and we sometimes risk our lives for them. So what I'm trying to say is that freedom is in the book, what I say is that freedom is the value of life, right? It's the value of life. And the reason why it's the value of life is that it's the condition which enables us to live among other values, other things which are good. So I wouldn't oppose freedom in life. Of course, if we're killed, we're not free. But I think it's very important not to regard us as being like other creatures that can be killed, or like other things in the world that can be stopped. There are reasons why we want to live, which go beyond just our biological existence. So I care about people, but why do I care about people? I care about people because they're human. And for me, the thing which is most human about us is our capacity for freedom. So I don't see this as a contradiction. I mean, I see people in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, who are willing to risk their biological existence because they think that freedom is worth it, or they think something else is worth it. And that makes a kind of sense to me. As far as democracy, I mean, maybe I wasn't clear. I wasn't saying that freedom and democracy are the same thing. I was saying that democracy fails without free people. that democracy is not something which proceeds automatically from the world, that democracy has to have an ethical or even metaphysical component to it, or else it will fail. So I hope that was helpful.
Дякую. І вам останнє запитання.
Містер Снайдер, дуже дякую вам за ваш голос, такий сильний голос в культурній дипломатії для України. От зараз Україна ввела, і навіть не зараз, ввела деякі обмеження на використання російської мови в медіа. Вчора президент Зеленський підписав закон, що забороняє імпорт книг російських. І в західному світі це може сприйнятися як оцей ексклюжн, як те, що ми, можливо, утискаємо наші права на нацменшинств. Яким чином, який був би ваш основний аргумент для людей, для дієвців, які працюють в царині культурної дипломатії, як пояснити, чому це важливо, чому важливо запрошувати українських культурних діячів, чому важливо підсилювати присутність української культури, скажімо так, робити такий мінус російській культурі і російській присутності. Який буде ваш головний аргумент? Перший, що буде одразу зрозумілий. Будемо дуже вдячні.
I see. It's a very practical question. So I guess there are different arguments for different audiences. One comparison. So one argument that you can make, which I happen to believe in, would be the post-colonial argument. And this is an argument that would probably work better with, you know, left-wing interlocutors, that Ukraine was in a colonial condition for a very long time, and like every other colonized country in history, essentially, it has a language policy afterwards. So if you look at the rest of the post-colonial world, you will find that very often the language of the empire is displaced as a matter of policy by some other language, right? So one argument would be the post-colonial argument. Another argument would be the national sovereignty argument, which is France. So France also has limits on, you know, when I lived in France, I found it very funny that they only allowed so much American content in their media. But I have to say, after a while, I became sympathetic to it because I realized that there was a question of power here, that Hollywood and American media simply had a kind of power which France could not equal. And therefore, it made sense for the French state to serve as a kind of referee. And France does that. France continues to do that. So there is a normal argument from national sovereignty that you can be a kind of referee, where in this case, it's just true that Russian media, the Russian book industry, the Russian book publication industry, Russian television, Russian films have a lot more money behind them than Ukrainian media do. And therefore, it's normal for the state to serve as a kind of referee. And then I think a third point, which is very important to make, is that people in Ukraine continue to speak Russian to each other. I mean, one of the things, you know, I'm not going to tell you what language to speak, like semena absolutno baiduja, but it's I think it's important for people in the West to hear that in Ukraine, people can speak to each other in Russian, because the propaganda is that, like, as soon as you send a text in Russian, like, they come and arrest you. So it's, and I know many of you sent texts in Russian today, right? So it's important to just clarify that in Ukraine, people speak Russian, and the point that, or they're allowed to. And the point that I often make is that, and this sometimes works, is I say that in Ukraine, people can say in Russian whatever they want to say, and they're not going to get in trouble. Whereas in Russia, people cannot say in Russia whatever they want to say. So, you know, you kind of turn the whole point around and point out that actually Ukraine is the country where you can say what you want in Russian. And Russia is the country where that's not true. So I hope that's helpful. I mean, those are all things that I happen to believe, or I wouldn't give them to you as useful talking points.
So, Тім, спасибі велике. за цю онлайн-лекцію. Ми погодилися на цю годину. Спасибі за цю годину часу, що приділили нам. І дякую. Це був Тім Снайдер, американський історик, професор Єльського університету, а також співочільник програми Documenting Ukraine Інституту гуманітарних наук у Відні, який підтримує наш захід і книжковий арсенал цього року. Дуже вам дякую. Ви можете ще раз дати аплодисменти, а я дам можливість йому послухати.
Окей. Дуже вам дякую. До побачення в Києві.
Дякую.
Дякую.